The Indian National Congress has proposed a minimum income guarantee scheme should they come to power. They're talking about giving 6,000 rupees per month to people in the 20% lowest income bracket in India. The question with a scheme like this is not just the cost, which is obviously the first thing that gets asked, but also the implementation of it. Joining us to talk about this is Praveen Chakravarty. Praveen, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us. I'm going to try and make this discussion as apolitical as possible, just trying to understand what a scheme like this would mean, no matter who were to implement it. So my first question to you is very, very basic. The last 1 year or so, the narrative has been about stress on the farm sector, the rural economy, and in particular the farm sector, because of income drop due to lower farm prices. Now, if you were to be tackling that problem, there would be a different set of solutions. For instance, long spoken about agriculture reforms, etc. What you are suggesting is something targeted at far deeper, which is income inequality. Do I get that right, firstly?
You're absolutely right, Ira, actually. One of the very few who picked up on this very core reason or the premise for doing this, which is income inequality. Or so much, the other side of income inequality is what? It is this exaggerated benefits of trickle-down economics that perhaps trickles down to a certain level, but maybe not below that. And that's an acknowledgement, I think, that all across the world, economists and policymakers have perhaps come to, especially in the modern contemporary economic development paradigm of technology and robotics and artificial intelligence, and as well as returns to capital versus returns to labor. So various causes for that, but fundamentally, can trickle-down benefits trickle down to the bottommost 5%, 10%, 20%? And perhaps the answer is no, and hence we need a direct policy remedy for that section of society.
Okay, but then there are two parts to that story then, Praveen. One is, like you said, perhaps some sort of, income equalizer, if I can call it, at the bottom end. But then that equalizer also has to extend to the top end, where you then have to combine a minimum income guarantee scheme with some sort of taxation or other policy at the top end. Because, if you want to equalize incomes to some extent, it has to be attacked at both ends, not just one.
No. Like I said, that's why I didn't stress so much on income inequality as I did on the benefits of trickle-down economics. The goal is not to make incomes more equal as opposed to actually providing a basic minimum income for those that are just left behind from economic development. So headline economic growth does not translate into real income growth for the bottom section of society. So it is for that section that we're talking about. The goal is not to compress the range of incomes in society, because that's a completely separate issue.
So you're not saying that a program like this, and I'm not even coming to the fiscal costs in a minute, I'll get to that, but you're not saying that a program like this must go hand in hand with some sort of, say a wealth tax or additional tax at the top level of incomes. You're not at all arguing that those two have to go together.
I'm only arguing philosophically. See, if we are talking about fiscal implications and where will we get the money and the revenues for it and all of that, that's a completely separate discussion. If you're philosophically arguing that any policy measure for the poorest 20% will have to necessarily be accompanied by some punitive taxation at the top end, I do not agree with that. Philosophically,
I think that's the core of sort of the inequality debate. I mean, globally also, if you look at it, it's been argued at both ends, right? That especially in the last 10 years, the people who have benefited most from the economy are the top end. So the divergence has actually increased. So if you want to reduce that divergence, you attack it at both ends.
See, the punitive taxation at the top end almost seems like a vengeful measure, and that's what I'm objecting to. Okay, if we are talking about fairness and justice and how, in order to be able to give a certain basic minimum income to the poorest section of society, we may have to have the richest sections of society share that burden, then that's a fiscal argument, and that I'm completely in agreement with. But the vengeful measure of being able to, of just punitive taxation at the high end is what I'm objecting to.
Okay, let me get to that fiscal argument as well, Praveen, because it is a core part of it. I think when the first set of numbers were put out, the calculations suggested a peak cost of about 3.5, 3.6 lakh crore. That does seem prohibitively expensive unless you then have a plan to merge in some of the existing subsidies, or again, a similar new revenue stream that is being discussed.
Yes, I think we must all start with, in the Indian context, as far as basic minimum income is concerned, with the 2017 economic survey, the chapter on basic income by former CEA Arvind Subramanian. Interestingly, that chapter starts with the line, wiping every tear from every eye. You don't necessarily associate drab economists with dramatic kind of opening sentences, but that's really what the survey chapter starts with. I mean, that tells you a lot more about the purpose and the goal of this. And actually, that chapter details out a fairly, in fair detail, a lot of the answers to the questions that you've asked for. First, let's talk about what will it cost, and then we'll talk about how will it get funded. Okay, what is this scheme? This scheme is to provide 6,000 rupees a month to the poorest 20% of households, which is 5 crore households. The simplest math of this is 3.5 lakh crores, right? Okay, so we have to talk about the implementation plan first before we start talking about the costs and the actual revenues of it. Costs and the actual funding of it. The implementation plan is that, of course, first and foremost, this will be a federal scheme. This will be a scheme for this where the center and the states will have to come together, especially in a post-GST India. All schemes, I believe, will have to be federal schemes with the states' participation. That's number one. Number two, there will be pilots and it will be rolled out in phases. So by the time we get to the full 5 crore households, which is the poorest 20%, it will be another, say 18 to 24 months. So there will be that phase-wise rollout. Okay, that's the broader implementation plan. Now, with that being said, in today's terms, it costs 1.8% of today's GDP. Of course, nominal GDP is going to grow, double digits, much faster, maybe closer to the higher end of 15% than at the current 10%. But nominal GDP will grow. As a cost to GDP, if you go back to 2017 chapter on UBI, the rough costs even back then were in the range of 1.5 to 2% of GDP. This range of 1.5 to 2% of GDP is almost a well-established and accepted cost for a program like this in most large economies. So let us just understand that this is 1.8% of today's GDP. Given the rollout plan that we have in mind, it is my belief, and my assumptions of nominal GDP growth, it is my belief that at no point in time will this exceed anywhere between 1.2% to 1.5% of GDP. Okay, so that's as far as the costs are concerned. Now, how will we fund this? When it comes to talking about funding, we have to look at both the revenue side of this scheme as well as the expenditure side. I think it is a little too simplistic to just say, okay, in order to fund this, something else has to go down, and it's almost like a switch. This comes in and this goes down. And I think that's just way too simplistic. Let's talk about the revenue side. What does this scheme do to the larger economy? This is remonetization of India's economy, which is money in the hands of people. Money in the hands of people, as we all know, leads to an immediate consumption boost, which leads to an investment demand, which hopefully leads to job creation and tax revenues, increase in tax revenues. So there is a larger macroeconomic implication of this from a tax revenue perspective. Second, we do believe that there are opportunities, low-hanging fruits if you want to call that, for tax buoyancy. And that primarily comes from GST simplification. You will hear about it in the manifesto that will be released on 2nd of April. But very simply put, it is our belief that a simplified GST with both on the rates front as well as on the logistics and the operational front will lead to tax buoyancy. GST has gone through its initial teething phases and there will be some tax buoyancy there. Third, there are other opportunities for revenue increases, which could be in the form of assets monetization or other taxation forms of revenues. So there are other revenue possibilities. So we must acknowledge that there are revenue implications as well. Now let's come to the expenditure side. Again, I will go back to the 2017 economic survey. In that, Arvind talks about 950 centrally sponsored schemes that were in existence as of that day, of which 11 core schemes are the food subsidies, NREGA, health, education, fertilizer, fuel, all of that. The remaining 939 schemes cost as much as these 11 schemes. So when we say that we will look at each of these in detail, we will look at where we can simplify, rationalize, and we believe it is possible. This is what we mean. Okay. So the two kind of fundamental tenets of this Nyaya scheme, as we call it, is one, on the one hand, it's social justice, dignity, self-respect for the poorest 20%. On the other hand, it's fiscal prudence. Okay. There is a commitment to fiscal prudence, and this came right from the top, I think. The Congress President mentioned it even in his press conference. So there is a commitment to fiscal prudence. And so it is our belief that it is possible to achieve both.
Praveen, a couple of follow-up questions on the revenue side firstly. So, we are running a revenue deficit right now, even though we were, expected to have eliminated it by this point in time. So, a country which is running a revenue deficit, over and top of that, you see a recurring expenditure it's not a one-year expenditure, this is a recurring expenditure which is going to come in every year of about 1.8 to 2% of GDP. Even if I take your argument that GDP will grow, so the percentage of GDP will decline, so 1.5% of GDP additional expenditure coming in, say, you're saying that just by tax buoyancy, and just by, for instance, some doing away with some of these centrally sponsored schemes, you can generate an equal amount of revenue to at least maintain status quo on revenue deficit, if not hope to eventually eliminate it, which we wanted to do for years on end.
That is correct. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Isn't that a little bit too ambitious? Really, we will be able to do away with so many centrally sponsored schemes without doing away with the basic ones. So food subsidy doesn't go, fertilizer subsidy doesn't go, the interest subsidy, at least on farm loans, I assume doesn't go, because those are core, sort of core subsidies. Without taking those away, you'll be able to save 1.5% of GDP on centrally sponsored schemes? Yeah,
see, again, I think the problem is it's making it too simplistic, saying, okay, we'll remove all the 939. First, all I'm saying is laying out a broad framework, right? First, it's a center and state scheme. Second, there are revenue implications. There will be revenue buoyancy. Third, there is opportunity for expenditure rationalization. Fourth, there are newer revenue opportunities, could be asset monetization, could be other forms of taxation. So, at this point in time, let's step back and not forget the broad context. We're at the manifesto stage.
I know, Praveen, but it's very tough to take
the chapter. He was in government.
I know, but you know this better than me, that it's very tough to take these, sort of proposals seriously unless one sees an implementation roadmap, right? Because otherwise it's a promise, and like you're saying, we'll do pilots earlier to begin with, maybe do this in a staggered fashion. Although I don't really understand how you would do this in a staggered fashion. Would you do regions? Would you do the bottom 5% first? I'm a little confused about what staggered would mean in a scheme like this. I understand the skepticism of promises made by political parties, especially given our experience in the last 5 years, and I fully understand and appreciate where you're coming from. But at this stage, it is extraordinarily unfair to ask, tell me exactly in detail in which scheme will be cut by how much, what exactly will your taxation policy be, what is your rollout plan, on which date will which districts get these people. I mean, come on, let us step back. I mean, the amount of detail we've given in terms of what we can do, the framework of it, and more importantly, it's not something that we just stood up and announced from a bully pulpit, one fine day.
This has taken work. It is now well known that we've consulted more than a dozen experts and economists from India and across the world. So there is some serious thought that's been given to this.
Okay, Praveen, let me talk about a different aspect. You know, I take your point that when budgets have to be made, they will be made. You know, we spoke to a bunch of people to try and understand the issue of identifying the people who fall into this 20% bucket. And these are all people you know and respect. So I'm going to read out some of the concerns that they raised. Pranab Bardhan said that, look, this will be a challenge given the lack of income data. Maitresh Ghatak raised the same concern, said that we've had this problem in the measurement of BPL families. A similar issue will happen there. Jayati Ghosh said that, you know, the SECC data, which seems like an obvious place to go to, has a number of issues. Besides, it has not been revised since 2011. It's not a very sort of, you know, real time or even 1 year, 2 year kind of periodic data set. How would you respond to some of these concerns in terms of identification?
I mean, I think all valid questions and concerns. There are a few ways that I would respond to it. One, I will admit that it was perhaps not possible to do something like this 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We do have much more data and information today than we did earlier. Second, we do have much more developments and advancements in data, big data and data analytics and technologies than we did earlier. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And third, most importantly, what we need to do is identify the poorest 5 crore households. We don't need to know the income of each household. We need to identify the 5 crore poorest households. Let me give you a counter example. I'm not saying this is an efficient scheme, but I will nevertheless give you this example. The government of India announced Ayushman Bharat. What is Ayushman Bharat? They said we will provide health insurance to 10 crore poor families. How did they identify the 10 crore poor families? The government of India said we will provide 2,000 rupees a month to landless farmers. I'm sure there are issues in the implementation of that scheme. But the fact that increasingly governments are embarking on targeted programs tells you something. Mr. Chidambaram, when we did a press conference in Chennai, reminded everybody that way back when he was in government and when the government launched the Narega scheme, exactly similar questions were raised. How will you target the poor? What will they do? How will you transfer the money? What kind of money transfer are we talking about? Where is the fiscal space for it? All of these things. I think it is, we will all acknowledge that Narega has by and large worked out extremely well. So I appreciate the concerns where people are coming from. But I do believe, having now looked at very large data sets myself, because that was really the first thing I did actually before we launched into this, look for income distribution data, look for consumption data, look for various poverty related data, look for household assets data. And lastly, more somewhat kind of cheekily, if I may suggest, it's all of you that claim today that political parties are now targeting households for votes. How is that possible on one hand, and this is not possible? If we can target households for votes, on various parameters, we surely know who's poor or rich.
Okay, I'll take that cheekiness on board, but I will still ask you. So, Praveen, give me an example then. Are you not starting with the SECC data? I think the World Inequality Lab suggested some household survey conducted by NCAER as a starting point. Give me a sense of what data sets you think are usable for something like this.
First of all, I do think there's household data that's available. I mean, I do not want to get into all the details of the data sets at this point in time for various reasons. But I will tell you, of course, the SECC, the IHTS, we could use government data sets, we could use some private sector data sets like the CMIE, consumer pyramids for surveys. There are various data sets that we can use. The idea is to triangulate across various data sets. But I will tell you, just today, I think most political parties at least have an entire data set of almost every household from the electoral rolls.
Okay, so you essentially you're saying that we will not run into the same or the extent of problems that we have run into in the past with, say, PDS, etc., where there's just been a lot of leakage, a lot of concerns about the wrong families getting the benefits. You think that in this age of big data, we'll be able to minimize some of those problems, essentially what you're saying.
Absolutely. Don't get me wrong. Not for a moment am I not saying this is not a challenge or an issue. All I'm saying is it's not an insurmountable challenge. It's not something that is so big a challenge that it should prevent us from even embarking on a completely new, radical new system of what I think Pratap Bhanu Mehta calls a new social contract between the state and the citizens. It's the first time that an economy of our size anywhere in the world is launching an unconditional cash transfer program. So I understand that this looks ambitious and audacious even, and hence, there's a lot of these concerns. But my simple point is, the mere issue of being able to identify the poorest 20% households is not a stumbling block for India to enter this new regime of social justice.
Okay, the only exception I'll take to it, Praveen, is that I wouldn't say it's a mere issue. The number of schemes which we have seen which have, led to large-scale leakages because of targeting problems, I mean, we've lived through that, right? We don't want to jump right back into it. But I will ask you one last question.
Is Narega functioning well or not?
It is.
So Narega is a targeted program. It may be self-targeted,
yes,
but it's not universal. It may be See, that's my point. It's not an insurmountable challenge. And you must listen to Mr. Chidambaram talk about it when he talks about exactly how these questions were raised when they launched Narega.
All right.
So and fortunately for us, it's exactly the same people who are associated with this that were associated with the launch of Narega. Dr. Manmohan Singh, P. Chidambaram, the Congress party leaders, all of them.
Okay. Praveen, I have one last question, and this is again, going back to philosophical issues. There is some concern that going into a direction of doles rather than encouraging, job seeking and job creation. And I know there's another scheme that you talked about where you also want to, incentivize job creation. But you're convinced that this is not something that is taking us in the wrong direction at a time as an economy where we should be incentivizing more and more people to go out and work. We are giving out, what some could call potentially a dole.
I hope you read Pratap Bhanu Mehta's column in the Indian Express today. I think calling this a dole just smacks of absolute elitist arrogance, in my view. If Arvind Subramaniam in 2017 thought India was ready for a universal basic income, if the economic idea of a basic income has been discussed and debated world over, there is something to this idea that is not a dole or a subsidy or some political promise. It's not an idea that just sprouted suddenly. It's an idea that's been well discussed and debated and thought through. I think we must acknowledge and respect that. Second, your question about what about jobs, why is this mutually exclusive? I think we're talking about two completely different things. This program, Nyay program, is a social justice program which recognizes the limitations of trickle-down benefits. For the remainders, the goal should be to create an environment where everybody can participate and create wealth and incomes, and that absolutely is not mutually exclusive to doing this. So I don't understand why this notion of we have to pick one or the other.
No, nobody's saying that. But for instance, Praveen, some people have made the case that, look, if Narega is working, why not sort of expand Narega? Why not put more funding behind Narega? Why not use that route to actually alleviate some of the stress, particularly in rural economies, which, as I started by saying, was the discourse over the last 1 year or so. So, to go in this direction is then taking on a far different challenge in income inequality, which, as again we discussed, should perhaps be attacked at both ends, not just at one with giving out money.
No, I think why not expand Narega, why not expand existing welfare versus doing something like this I think is a very healthy point for discussion and debate, and that's why I keep saying that this is a departure, this is a new social contract. Why? Because it's a cash transfer. It's unconditional. So what does a cash transfer and an unconditional cash transfer do? It does not just only supplement incomes, it provides freedom. It provides economic freedom, freedom of choice to people, rather than saying you have to go do this work to earn this money, or you have to get so many kilos of subsidized rice. I'm not saying they're exclusive, but this is a unconditional cash transfer, which is a radical departure from how we've thought about welfare for so many decades.
All right, Praveen, I'll leave it there. Perhaps we will get a chance to speak more in detail if and when this program does get implemented. Thanks so much for joining us here on Bloomberg Quint.
Thank you.